Today, we'll be discussing Season 6, Episode 7 of Rick and Morty, which is known for having the most incomprehensible jokes. I briefly mentioned this episode in my general review video of Season 6. However, at the beginning of the episode, we see a summary of the previous episodes of Rick.
Previously on Rick and Morty.
Then, we watch the scene in Season 6, Episode 3 where the Beths start to date each other. And in Season 6, Episode 6, we see Rick using his portal gun. However, scenes that we haven't seen before start to emerge.
This happened too.
And Rick gradually realizes this. Jerry is dying, and during this, Rick tells Morty to stop and say that he will marry me. Suddenly, the series turns into a wedding, and here Rick says he wants to go to an ionized and sealed room with no entrance or exit during their honeymoon. When it happens instantly, Rick explains that this room will slow down the story and the montage they experienced is not real. Our friends realize that Rick is stuck in something called the spiral, which he named in previous episodes, but the story continues to progress in the previous episodes. We see that he will be executed because he released text bees that killed the liver, and at this moment Rick ensures that they return to the room. In later episodes, Rick sees previous Leon, who put them in the loop in the room, and our friends hold on to him and pass through the opening credits of the series.
Next time on Rick and Morty.
Next time on Rick and Morty?
No, previously on Rick and Morty.
Previous Leon is a reference to the name Previously On, which means what happened in previous episodes. After the credits, Morty starts vomiting because he learned they were in a series. Rick tells them not to care about previous Leon's pointless meta-references about them being a series, but Leon claims that it's very cool and breaks the fourth wall to escape to the meta layer to find himself. Rick gives Morty a special glasses to find Leon, and Morty sees Rick's garage through the eyes of the series writers. The name given to the illogical way in which main characters in movies and stories are suddenly rescued when they are cornered in traitors' machinas or stories. In Lord of the Rings, we can use the example of eagles saving everyone at once. Similarly, in Chekhov's The Gun, when a gun is shown in the beginning of the scene, it usually means it will be used later in the story. At the end of the chapter, we see our friends with these guns. Meanwhile, Morty expresses his dislike for what is happening and Rick responds with Rick up. According to Rick, occasionally acknowledging the audience, like saying Selam Kakmak, can be fun, but when the whole episode is about the show being self-aware, it can get old. When our friend mentions this, it's ironic because the entire episode is about the show being self-aware. Rick and the writers tell the audience that they made meta jokes in this episode about the show being self-aware. If you like the episode, that's great, but if you don't, remember that even Rick wasn't happy with what was happening, so you should try to like it either way. Of course, just because they anticipated future criticisms and responded to them doesn't mean those criticisms are wrong. Later in the episode, our friends enter a meta layer, and Rick tells the writers what they're doing with this episode and how the strange jokes they're making won't do much. Indeed, this episode contains jokes that not everyone will understand, using story terms that are difficult to follow. Similarly, in the train episode of Season 4, you had to know a lot to understand what was happening. Personally, I like it when the show takes risks like this. Nowadays, all movies and TV shows tend to have overly simplistic dialogue and storylines to make them easy to understand. Rick and Morty relies on its audience in the continuation of the story. In the 2021 special film, there is a reference where Rick and Morty made fun of the series for having characters appearing in a bad movie like Space Cam that makes fun of everything. Later, it is believed that Leon was a deception and that everything that happened was part of the plan of the army in the break episode. In the video, Leon comes out of the toy he was stuck in and enters reality. His wish is to find a purpose, but Rick and Morty do not approve of this desire. In most stories, the characters' wishes and goals are significant. Ultimately, characters act to achieve their goals. It is funny that Storylord's goal is to find a purpose, which is a lazy and meta joke. Storylord looks at the address in the box where he is and goes to his creator, the writer, who explains why he is in a miserable state, saying that he is in this state because the character is useless. The show's writers initially wanted to make the train episode in the style of Counter, but no one in the writer's room had actually read the stories written between 1387 and 1400, which are considered the beginning of modern English literature. It's really fun that the show mocks its own writers' odd behaviors. In one episode, the writers were inspired by the villains playing poker and telling different stories about Batman in the 90 Seconds Batman cartoon, but they ultimately gave up on the idea. Normally, we would have seen the rhythm enemies talking throughout the entire train episode, as at the beginning of that episode. Even in that section, Rick was mocking the idea of the scenario being considered anthological like the Batman episode. He broke down the fourth wall and now they're breaking down the fifth and sixth walls as well. The writer in the episode is complaining about how the trains in the train section were never actually put up for sale. Yes, normally this train was actually going to be put up for sale, but most likely due to a comedic reason, they couldn't make it happen because there was a problem in the supply chains. Anyway, after this strange dialogue, Star-Lord asks for motivation from the writer. If he writes, Star-Lord tells him that his motivation could be his motivation, considering he has come this far looking for motivation. At first, our Lord was angry, but he accepted it. He takes Rick and Morty to a building belonging to a group of 6 who refer to themselves as a reference to them. They made a pun that means to surprise when read together. When Miss Lead risks an attack, Rick stops her using a meta shield. But another member of the group has a flashback. Using the power to look back at what happened in the stories, he learns how Rick used the shield and tries to remove it. The other members of the group can instantly create continuity errors that can suddenly stop the scenes that can switch to another scene with the power of an abrupt transition. A technique used when writing a script that can change the story abruptly and change the protagonist. The things this sextet does refer to the techniques used in writing scripts. The last member of the group can change the scenarios, saying that everything was actually said from the beginning. A technique that audiences generally do not like. But sometimes writers can show what happened in old movies as if it were something else just to move the story forward. Meanwhile, Rick takes out a robot he knew from before from his pocket. In the 9th episode of the first season, we saw Rick doing the same thing with this robot. After making the robot, he asked the robot to bring butter, and when he did, he asked about the purpose of his life. I think this is a great scene. This butter robot reminds me of the transition from childhood to adulthood. Babies are generally not aware of anything when they are born, then they grow up and turn into enthusiastic, creative, and energetic children. But after becoming adults, most of us realize that the life offered to people in today's world is not much different from the butter that the robot brings. Children who were raised with great hope lose their hopes every year, and after years, they turn into robots who think that it is normal for the world to forget their childhood. Of course, this doesn't apply to everyone here. Our friend Redkin starts to change everything, saying that there has been nothing here from the beginning, and that the building is actually an orange. Meanwhile, the characters from the advertisement are trying to return from the meta-universe to their own universe after coming out of the orange. Rick is responsible for what happens to our characters. At the beginning of the episode, Leon follows him because she is angry. And just as our duo is about to die, a writer named Joseph Campbell comes and saves them. Yes, this episode is one of the weirdest and most ridiculous episodes of Rick and Morty for those who don't know. Joseph Campbell is an important writer who says that all stories progress similarly. The creators of Rick and Morty, Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland, use a technique called the hero's journey that is similar to this when writing the series. While our friends are thinking about how to return, Morty comes up with an idea to show Rick and Morty returning to their homes in previous episodes using meta properties, and thus our friends can return home. Leon agrees, but they are unsuccessful. Then, Morty becomes pregnant, and Rick begins to make a device that can take them out. At this point, we learn that Rick manipulated Leon without her knowing to help him make this device. Afterwards, we find out that Morty did not actually become pregnant, and our friends return from the video of the series to the real world. On Earth, Story-Lord takes everyone's motivation in the universe and uses the man who writes himself to convince him that he should not try anymore and do nothing. With the help of Campbell, Morty convinces the writer that he is a bad writer and should not write anymore. Meanwhile, Story-Lord tells Rick that he wants to be the new villain of the show, but Rick ignores him. Eventually, Morty convinces the writer and they defeat Story-Lord. In the final scene, we see the writer considering Campbell's advice and deciding to write a story with a magical pen that writes its own story. Campbell's advice was misunderstood, and the writer becomes obsessed with writing a new story. I think this episode is both funny and difficult to follow, but it does not address the existential pains and anxieties that the best episodes of Rick and Morty deal with. Nevertheless, it is an enjoyable episode to watch.